It was a quiet night in the small village of Ravenswood. The rain fell relentlessly against the windows of the old house at the edge of the woods. The house, once a place of warmth and laughter, had become a hollow shell of memories. Overgrown ivy clung to the walls, and the doors creaked with every gust of wind. Inside sat Eleanor, an artist who had recently moved to the village to escape the hustle of city life. She had hoped for peace, a place to focus on her work. But as the rain tapped against the glass, she felt an unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the weather. For weeks, Eleanor had been hearing whispers in the night, soft, almost unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the walls. At first, she dismissed them as the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old building. But the whispers had grown louder, more distinct. They spoke her name. Eleanor. Eleanor shivered, her paintbrush freezing mid-stroke. The whispers echoed, not just in her ears, but inside her mind. She stood, her heart racing, and moved toward the window. The storm outside was intensifying, but the sight was oddly serene. The trees swayed with the wind, their leaves rustling in a language she couldn't understand. Then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw something. A figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the misty rain. Its silhouette was distorted, as if the figure was made of smoke. She blinked, but it remained. The whispers came again, louder this time. "Do not go to the woods, Eleanor. Do not go." It was a warning, but she felt a strange pull, an inexplicable desire to follow the voice. Despite her fear, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The rain soaked her through, but she felt no cold, only a strange warmth that seemed to grow with every step. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by the faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. She moved deeper into the trees, drawn forward by the voice that had called her. There, in the heart of the forest, she found a small clearing. In the center stood an old weathered well. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around her like a storm of voices. She knelt beside the well, peering into the darkness below. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the depths of the well, cold and clammy, grasping at her. She screamed, pulling back in terror, but the hand tightened its grip. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, and fell to the ground. The figure she had seen earlier emerged from the shadows, its smoke-like form taking shape. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, eyes hollow. She whispered, "You should have never come. This place, it claims all who listen." Eleanor's mind raced. The rain fell harder, now sounding like a drumbeat in her ears, drowning out everything else. She had to escape. She had to... But before she could move, the woman's voice became a loud wail, the sound vibrating through the air, shaking the trees around her. In an instant, the world around her twisted and spun. The rain, the whispers, and the woman. All of it melted into one overwhelming sensation of fear. Then, silence. When Eleanor awoke, she was back in her bed, drenched in sweat, the storm outside now a distant hum. Had it all been a dream? Or had the woods claimed her in some other way? The rain continued to fall. The night grew darker in Ravenswood, as though the very air had thickened with dread. Eleanor, a quiet artist who had moved to this secluded village for its tranquility, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The old house she had bought was beautiful, but unnerving. It stood on the edge of the woods, with a history that the villagers only whispered about when they thought no one was listening. At first, Eleanor had loved the solitude. Her days were filled with painting, the sound of rain against the windows providing a constant, soothing backdrop to her work. But then, the whispers started. It had been subtle at first, just a murmur during the night, almost as though the wind were carrying voices from a distant place. But over the course of weeks, they became more distinct, as if someone, something, was speaking directly to her. Eleanor, they whispered, soft and almost loving. But no matter how much she tried to ignore them, they grew louder, darker. Sometimes they were accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps in the hall, though she knew she was the only one in the house. And at night, when she lay in bed, the whispers would become so overwhelming that they echoed inside her skull, like a chorus of voices begging her to listen. Eleanor, come to the woods. The rain outside had turned into a relentless downpour, the windows rattling under its intensity. Eleanor sat by the fire, trying to drown out the whispers with the crackling of the logs. But the moment the fire went quiet, the whispers returned, their voices seeping into her. The voice sounded different this time, deeper, darker, almost mocking. It was followed by another, then another, as though the voices were multiplying, echoing from every corner of the house. Eleanor, come to us. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest like a drum. She could no longer tell if the voices were real, or if they were just figments of her imagination. But the pull to follow them was undeniable. The rain outside seemed to shift in rhythm, synchronizing with the voices, as if the storm was feeding off her fear. Against her better judgment, Eleanor stood up. The house seemed to close in around her as she stepped into the darkened hall. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, groaning as though the house itself was groaning in protest. The whispers led her to the door, which opened with a groan, as if it had been waiting for her. The storm outside lashed at her, the rain so thick she could barely see where she was going, but the pull in her chest, like a string attached to her heart, drove her forward. She found herself in the woods, the tall trees towering over her like silent sentinels. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground beneath her feet was slick with mud. The whispers came again, louder now, all around her. Do not turn back. The voice was unmistakable now. It was speaking directly to her. It knew her. Suddenly, through the mist and rain, she saw it. A figure standing still in the distance, barely discernible against the dark trees. At first, it seemed to be a shadow, but as Eleanor stepped closer, the figure became clearer. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, eyes hollow like two pits of blackness, her lips curled into a cruel smile. Come closer, Eleanor, the figure whispered. And for the first time, Eleanor felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't scared. The woman's voice was soothing, almost maternal, like a lullaby. But just as she took a step forward, the whispers turned frantic, desperate. No, don't listen. She is not real. Eleanor's head spun. She couldn't tell who was speaking, whether it was the woman or the voices that had followed her, but they were all melding together in a cacophony of sound. Her vision blurred, and the forest around her seemed to warp and twist. The trees stretched high above her, their branches bending and reaching, as if they were trying to trap her. The woman's form wavered, her shape blurring like smoke. She reached out, her hands long and skeletal, fingers curled in a way that didn't seem human. I've waited for you, Eleanor, the woman hissed, her voice now a guttural whisper that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. Now, you are mine. In a flash, Eleanor felt herself falling, as if the earth had opened beneath her. The woman's hands grabbed at her, pulling her into the void. The air around her grew cold, the whispers louder and more demanding. Her body was weightless, her limbs thrashing as if she were falling through time itself. Then, silence. Eleanor awoke in her bed once more, gasping for air, her sheets soaked in sweat. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside eerily still. She blinked, confused, disoriented, as though she had just woken from a long, terrible dream. But when she looked out the window, she saw it. A faint outline of the woman standing in the rain-soaked woods, watching her with those hollow eyes. The rain began to fall again, and with it, the whispers. Louder this time. Eleanor, it's not over. And dread. The rain, the whispers, and the unsettling presence of the woman pull Eleanor deeper into a psychological nightmare, blurring the line between reality and the haunting forces that call her. The storm had become a constant presence in Eleanor's life ever since she arrived in Ravenswood. At first, the rain had been a soothing soundtrack to her isolation. But now, the rhythmic tapping against the windows felt like a countdown. Each drop a warning, each thunderclap a beckoning. Eleanor sat at her canvas, her brush hovering above it as the whispers called to her, growing more insistent with each passing day. The soft, almost melodic voices were no longer confined to the walls. They filled her mind, swirling through her thoughts like a dark river, guiding her hand on the canvas before she even realized it. It wasn't just the house. The whispers had followed her. They lived within her now. No matter how hard she tried to drown them out, they always found a way through. At night they whispered her name in 1,000 different tones, sometimes loving, sometimes taunting, always with the same promise. Come to the woods, Eleanor. Come to us. She couldn't sleep. The sheets twisted around her legs as she tossed and turned in the dark, the voices growing louder, sharper. She heard them behind her, beside her, sometimes even in her own breath. The storm outside seemed to fuel them, the rain a constant echo of their insidious words. It was always the same warning. Don't go to the woods. But something was pulling her there. One night, when the rain was at its peak, Eleanor could stand it no longer. She could feel the whispers burrowing deep into her mind, carving paths that led her thoughts straight into the darkness. She needed to know what lay beyond the boundary of her house. What was it that wanted her to go to the woods? What would happen if she obeyed? The moment she opened the door to step outside, the cold, wet air hit her like a slap. The rain pummeled her skin, but she didn't feel it. The pull was too strong. She stumbled out into the woods, her feet sinking into the soggy earth as she moved deeper into the forest. The trees loomed around her like ancient guardians, their gnarled branches twisting in strange patterns as if they were trying to entangle her. The whispers surrounded her. They weren't just voices anymore. They were forms, breathing, living things that danced around her in the dark. Her footsteps felt as though they were in rhythm with the sound of the rain, the rhythm of her heartbeat, slow and steady, like a countdown. And then she saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the heavy mist, was the figure. The same pale woman from her dreams, standing motionless in the center of the clearing, her long dark hair swirling with the wind. Her face was a void, nothing but a blackened, smooth surface. Her eyes were deep, hollow, and the longer Eleanor stared at her, the more she felt herself being drawn toward her, as though her very soul were being pulled by invisible strings. "Come closer," the woman whispered. "Come to me, Eleanor. Come, and I will show you everything." Every step Eleanor took toward the woman seemed to stretch time. The world around her began to bend. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like fingers. The rain fell harder, colder, as though it were falling through her very bones. Suddenly the woman's lips parted, and a voice that was not her own spoke, dark, deep, and filled with an ancient malice. "She cannot hear you. You are not meant to leave." Eleanor froze. The voice did not belong to the woman, but to something older, something that had been waiting for her. Her breath caught in her throat as the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. In that moment, the trees shifted, revealing another figure. It was a man, but his body was distorted, his skin stretched over his bones like a mask, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a grin of pure malice, stretching too far, too wide. "Do you think you were chosen?" he hissed, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Do you think they called you here to welcome you?" Eleanor wanted to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The air around her grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The whispers now screamed in her ears, so loud, so demanding. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. "No, please, I don't want this," she gasped. But the words were useless. They were swallowed by the night. The woman's figure wavered, her form blurring like smoke. She stepped forward, her face still an abyss, and for the first time Eleanor felt true terror. The figure reached out a hand, its long, gnarled fingers brushing against Eleanor's cheek. "You were always meant to be part of us," the woman murmured, her voice echoing in Eleanor's mind. But now, Eleanor turned, frantic, searching for a way out. But the forest had changed. The trees were no longer trees. They had become twisted, writhing masses of dark roots and limbs, stretching out toward her like monstrous hands. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She ran. Her feet slid on the wet earth as the whispers followed, relentless. The woman's figure dissolved into the shadows behind her. But the eyes, those hollow eyes, remained fixed on her, tracking her every movement. She didn't know how far she ran, or for how long. The forest seemed endless, stretching into an eternity. The sound of her footsteps was swallowed by the whispers, until all she could hear was the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Suddenly, the world shifted again. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vanish, and she was falling into nothingness. The wind roared around her as she descended, faster and faster, into a void that had no end. The whispers surrounded her, 1,000 voices screaming in unison, their words impossible to understand. But then, in the midst of the chaos, Eleanor heard a new voice. Louder, clearer. It was coming from inside her mind. "You are ours, Eleanor. You have always been ours." The ground crashed into her, throwing her into darkness. She lay there, disoriented, her body numb. The storm now a distant hum. She couldn't move, couldn't think. All she could feel was the presence that surrounded her, the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her to fall into its grasp. And then, from the darkness, the woman's voice came again. "Welcome home, Eleanor." The words echoed, hollow and final. The storm, the whispers, the rain, it had all been leading to this moment. The house, the woods, the woman, they were all part of it. Part of the dark, twisting nightmare that had been consuming her. And now there was no escape. Eleanor's senses were fractured, like glass shards scattered across the floor of her mind. Every sound felt distorted, every shadow seemed to stretch into infinity, and the very air around her had grown thick, as if it were pulsing with something alive, something hungry. She lay in the darkness, trembling. The earth beneath her was cold, unnaturally so, as if the very ground had been drained of warmth. Her fingers scraped at the soil, but the earth seemed to shift beneath her touch, like it was alive, pulling her deeper. Eleanor. The voice was softer now, a whisper that sent ripples of terror through her body. It wasn't the woman this time. No, this voice was different, more ancient, more primal, and filled with a maddening urgency. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the vast, oppressive silence. The whispers had stopped. The forest had gone still. It was as if everything had paused, waiting. But then, she felt it, the tug again, deep within her chest, like an invisible thread pulling her, guiding her. Slowly she pushed herself up, her legs shaking beneath her, and she found herself standing in front of the well. The same one she had seen earlier, its ancient stones now cracked and oozing with dark, viscous liquid that dripped into the earth, sizzling as if it were burning through reality itself. The woman was gone, but the air was thick with her presence, like the shadow of her form still lingered in the corner of Eleanor's vision. The well seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, a sickening rhythm that echoed in her skull. "Do you feel it?" the voice whispered again, a low guttural tone that sent a shiver down her spine. It came from everywhere, seeping into her mind like oil, thick and dark. Eleanor staggered back, the world around her spinning. She tried to turn, to flee, but the trees had changed. They were no longer towering and rooted in the earth. They were towering figures, twisting into grotesque shapes, their limbs reaching for her like monstrous hands, their trunks pulsating with an unsettling life force. Eyes, hundreds of them, opened along their bark, glimmering with malice. The forest, no longer a refuge, had become her prison. It was a still night in the quiet village of Ravenswood. Rain lashed against the windows of Eleanor's old weathered house, perched at the edge of the woods. She had moved there, hoping for solitude, to fuel her creativity as an artist. Instead, the house offered her something far darker, something she could never have imagined. At first, the whispers blended with the rain, faint and easy to dismiss. "It's just the wind," Eleanor told herself, brushing off the eerie sounds echoing through the wooden walls. But as the nights grew longer and the storms more relentless, the whispers became impossible to ignore. They were soft, yet distinct, calling her name. Eleanor. She froze one night, the brush in her hand trembling as she painted by candlelight. The voice wasn't just in her ears, it echoed inside her mind. Setting down her brush, she turned to the window. The rain ran down the glass like tears, blurring the dark woods outside. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was faint, as if made of smoke, but it stood perfectly still, despite the storm raging around it. Her breath caught as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Do not go to the woods, Eleanor. Do not go." It was a warning, but one she felt powerless to heed. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and stepped into the downpour. The rain drenched her within moments, but it wasn't cold. Instead, a strange warmth seemed to guide her deeper into the forest. The woods were unnaturally silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. They led her to a small clearing she had never seen before. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling well. Eleanor approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging her forward. She peered into the darkness of the well, her reflection rippling in the water far below. Then a hand shot out. It was impossibly long, pale and dripping with water. It seized her wrist with an icy grip, pulling her toward the well's edge. She screamed, struggling against it, but the hand held firm. Out of the shadows emerged the figure from before, a woman with hollow eyes and a face twisted in anguish. Her voice was a mournful wail. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed. "You've heard the whispers. Now you belong to them." The rain seemed to grow heavier, the weight of it pressing Eleanor to the ground. She clawed at the earth, trying to free herself, but the hand only pulled harder. The last thing she saw was the woman's face, a twisted mask of sorrow and rage, before everything went black. When Eleanor awoke, she was back in her bed. The storm had passed, and the whispers were gone. For a brief moment she thought it might have all been a terrible dream, but her wrist still bore the icy imprint of a hand, and the sound of water dripping echoed faintly from the walls. As she sat up, the rain began to fall again. This time the whispers returned. Eleanor. She realized then that she could never leave. The house, the woods, the whispers. They were part of her now. And she, part of them. you